Boldwood presents Hopes and Dreams for the Seaside Girls, written by Tracy Baines and read by Julie Maisie. Chapter 1. Cleethorpes, Sunday the 3rd of September 1939. Frances O'Leary lay on top of her bed in Barkhouse Lane, watching the shaft of light grow stronger through the gap in the curtains as the sun rose. She'd left them like that when she'd arrived home from the theatre with Jessie Delaney, her fellow variety girl, in the early hours. It had been a night of excitement, followed by hours of worry, and she hadn't bothered to undress, unable to sleep, her mind busy with what might happen today. German troops had marched into Poland only 2 days before, and the Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, had been forced to issue an ultimatum. If Hitler didn't withdraw his troops, they would be at war. It felt to Frances like the whole world had been holding its breath, hoping against hope that they wouldn't be at conflict again. But what did hope ever achieve? A quiet tapping on her bedroom door interrupted her thoughts, and Jessie stuck her head around it. "Can I come in?" Her friend's eyes were puffy and red from crying, her face blotchy. How soon happiness turned to tears. Frances felt for her young friend, forgetting her own worries and fears and forcing them to the back of her mind. Of course. Frances slung her legs over the bed, went over to the window and drew back the heavy blackout curtains to reveal a blue, almost cloudless sky. Down in the yard, their landlady, Geraldine, was slicing beans from the stalk with her ivory-handled penknife, dropping them into a white enamel pan on the path. As though sensing she was being watched, Geraldine turned and looked up at her, and Frances put up a hand in greeting. "I haven't slept anyway." "I don't think any of us have. Mum and Geraldine have been in the back room since 6. Frances smiled. "Ah, but your lack of sleep will be for different reasons." Jessie came beside her and the girls linked arms. Harry's proposal, a London impresario coming to hear you sing, and in Cleethorpes of all places. What a wonderful night it was for you. Jessie gave her a half-hearted smile. It was, and it wasn't. She let out a heavy sigh. Life's complicated, isn't it? Frances could only agree. And the older you got, the more complicated it became. But she couldn't tell Jessie that. Instead, she said, "Lots to look forward to. A ring, a wedding." "But when?" Jessie's voice cracked. "If the news is bad today, and we know that it will be, don't." Frances loosened her arm. They couldn't give in to dark thoughts. It didn't help. "You have to think of all the wonderful things that lie ahead for you and Harry. You'll need to set a date, find a dress, and that's just the start of your good fortune. Your mum must be so excited for you." Harry and Jessie had met almost a year ago when Jessie was secretary at her Uncle Norman's legal practice in Norfolk, and Harry a solicitor. He'd recently joined the RAF, and Jessie was proud but afraid. Frances tugged her friend close. "For a girl with the world at her feet, you're awfully glum." Jessie leaned her head on Frances's shoulder. "I know. All my dreams coming true at once. Only it's not what I thought it would be. I'm so confused." She lifted her head and turned to Frances, the fear clear in her eyes. "If it's war, Harry won't be safe. None of us will." Frances gripped her friend's shoulders and gave her a bit of a shake, hoping to dislodge the despair. "Harry will be back before you know it." They had to be strong, for who knew what lay before them? She changed tack. "Enough of that. I didn't get a chance to talk to you much last night. There was so much going on, and I am desperate to know how it went with Vernon Leroy." Jessie smiled then. "Oh, Frances, always turning your face to the sun, looking for the good. What would I do without you?" "You'd manage," Frances grinned. She couldn't have Jessie losing her spark. It was what Frances loved about her. They'd met when Jessie was the latecomer to the dancing troupe who were appearing for the 3-month summer season at the Empire. She'd arrived with nowhere to stay, and Frances had brought her to Barkhouse Lane, which Geraldine had taken on only a week before, having inherited it from her aunt. The terraced house had been drab and neglected, but over the last 2 months they'd all worked together to make it a cosy home. "Come on, tell me what the marvellous Mr. Leroy said." I was so excited, so nervous that I can't remember half of it. Jessie's green eyes began to recover their sparkle. Harry had just proposed, and I was walking on air. We went back to the dressing room together, and Mr. Leroy was there with Mum and the star of the show, Madeline Moore. She stopped, smiled. He told me I had a great voice, had a great future ahead of me. He's thinking of putting me in his next West End production. That's wonderful, isn't it? Jessie shrugged. It would have been a few weeks ago, but now that Mum and Eddie are here with me, it's different. I don't want to leave them again. Harry's in the RAF, and if it's war— Her voice faltered as fear took hold. Frances released her arm. Look at it this way. You're with your family, and you're doing what you love. That's everything, isn't it? It was so much more than she had herself. It had been 4 years since she'd seen her own family. 4 long, lonely years. Jessie lifted her head. Oh, Frances, you're right. Here's me going on like an idiot, when we'll perhaps have worse things to worry about soon. She paused. Harry was so glad that I was here with you and Geraldine. He said he knew we'd all look out for each other. And he's right, Frances agreed. They had become as tight-knit as any family. She hadn't realised it before, but now, as they stood on the brink of war, she knew that that's what they meant to each other. I'm so glad to have a friend like you, someone to share all my happiness and fears with, my secrets. Guilt pierced Frances. Secrets. Should she tell of her own? To do so would be such a relief. To share all that brought her happiness, gave her joy. Jessie's eyes were bright with expectation. No, not yet. This is her moment, she told herself. Don't spoil it. She nudged Jessie's shoulder. Don't be daft. What about your mum and your brother? Jessie rested her hand against the window frame, thoughtful. Her mother, Grace, had been so ill when Jessie brought her to stay at Barkhouse Lane at the end of July, rescuing her from the neglect of Grace's cousin's wife, Iris, and nursing her back to health. Her younger brother, Eddie, had been set to inherit the family legal firm, not that he wanted to, for he was mad about engines. But all the same, it was lost opportunities, so Jessie had her own guilt to contend with, and Frances didn't need to burden her with any more. I can't talk to them like I can to you. I can't tell them how afraid I am. She frowned. Mum's thrilled to bits for me, but she's still not well. And Eddie? She smiled. Eddie is thriving too, isn't he? Frances agreed, and Jessie went on. Do you know, when I first brought them here, I thought I'd done the worst thing, that I'd been rash and made a mistake. But it all turned out right in the end. Things do, don't they, if we have courage? If only courage was all it took. Frances looked at the younger girl, her freshness, her innocence. At 18, Jessie's age, she had been innocent too. Then it all changed. She turned away, reaching past Jessie for her wash bag, which lay on the chair at the bottom of the bed. When she turned back, she made sure she was smiling. Let's go downstairs. I need to freshen up. We have no idea what the day will bring, and I want to be ready to greet whatever comes. In the back sitting room, Grace and Geraldine were sitting at the oak table, stripping and slicing runner beans. An old copy of the Grimsby Telegraph was spread over it, a growing pile of ends and strings in the middle, the sliced beans mounting in a colander. They looked up as the girls came in. Morning, Frances said. Morning, Grace replied, making short work of the last bean and deftly wrapping the paper around the scrapings. Geraldine got up and took it from her along with the colander, and Frances followed her into the kitchen. Let me get rid of these and we'll get on with breakfast, same as we always do, eh? Not waiting for a reply, Geraldine put the colander on the side and went out to the dustbin. Frances picked up the kettle and the gas popped as she placed it on the stove. The plans for lunch were on the side. The potatoes scraped, carrots chopped, and now the beans would sit alongside them. Everything prepared in advance. It was the same every Sunday, she presumed, for she was always up and out, no matter how late they got back from the theatre the night before. "Are you not going to see your friend this Sunday?" Grace called through to her. Frances wrung out a dishcloth and went back into the room. "I thought I'd wait until after the Prime Minister's announcement at 11 and then go." Grace lifted her hands as Frances wiped the table. "As luck would have it, her husband's home from sea for a few days. She won't be on her own." "That's good," Grace said. "Bad news is more bearable shared." Frances leaned against the doorframe. "It is, and at least we'll know one way or another what it's to be." She felt the draught as Geraldine entered from outside. "It's the indecision that's wearying, not knowing one way or another." "Rather the indecision than war." Geraldine was brisk. She went back to her chair at the head of the table. "Yes, of course." A small voice was telling Frances to have courage. "It's just that I can't forget the children I saw on Friday, standing in little crocodiles, being led towards the station, evacuated to heaven knows where." The image had stayed with her. Mothers trying to be brave, children clutching teddies, labels tied to their coats. The innocence of them, and no idea of where they were going, or when they would be coming back. "It's good that you don't have to, Frances. I wouldn't wish it on any mother," Grace said quietly. "No." Frances folded her arms, tucking them away. If she could only talk to them of her worries, her fears, it might help. Grace was kind. She would understand, wouldn't she? There was a thump from up above. Then she heard Eddie, Jessie's brother, thunder down the stairs. He burst into the room, briefly stilling the conversation. He was in his pyjamas, his wavy brown hair in disarray, and he yawned, rubbing his hand over his face and grinning, his teeth white against his tanned skin. The tension in the room seemed to break as Eddie settled himself at the table, and Frances knew the moment to speak had slipped away. The kettle began to whistle, and Geraldine returned to the kitchen. The smell of bacon filled the air, and the fat sizzled when Geraldine cracked eggs into the frying pan. Frances's stomach felt cavernous, but she wasn't hungry. Were any of the others? Jessie came beside her and filled the teapot. Frances sliced the bread and took it into the room along with the butter, plates and cutlery. The two of them went back for the bacon and eggs, and Geraldine joined them, pouring the tea as the girls sat down side by side at the table. Frances watched Grace as she studied her son, the worry clear in her eyes. She caught Frances looking, and they exchanged a smile. Jessie cut a slice of bread in half, scraped a little butter across it, lifted it, then put it down again. "Surely Chamberlain will be able to resolve things peacefully. He said it was peace with honour not so long ago. Hitler must keep his word." "People say lots of things," Geraldine said. "It's what they do that counts." Frances nodded. She had believed her lover's empty promises. If only she'd been so wise. "But we have to hope for the best, don't we?" Jessie was almost pleading for the others to agree with her. Frances looked down at her plate. She should eat. She should tell them. She picked up her fork. "We do, darling," Grace said, "and you have so much to look forward to. Before long you'll be down in London. Your name in lights." "Not in a blackout it won't, Mum," Eddie said. "It won't be allowed." Grace glowered at him and he shrugged. He reached for a cup and ladled in 3 spoonfuls of sugar. Grace raised an eyebrow. "What?" He quickly stirred the tea, took a quick gulp. "I'm caddying for my boss, Mr. Coombs. It's a long walk around that golf course." Grace replaced her cup on the saucer. "Surely he won't play golf, today of all days?" Eddie nodded, hurrying to finish another mouthful of food. "He said he would. He told me that he wasn't going to spoil a good round of golf for something he couldn't influence." "I agree with him," Geraldine said. "But we'll all have to do our bit, as we did the last time." Grace briefly closed her eyes. Was she remembering her husband, Davy, who had fought in the Great War? He'd returned a broken man, as so many of them had. "Well, I'm going, Mum," Eddie said. Listening to the radio won't change things. He would be 15 in a couple of weeks, still a boy, but almost a man. Almost. If it was war and it went on, then Eddie would be called up. Francis shivered. Grace leaned forward and ruffled his hair. Better get yourself dressed then, unless you're thinking of going around the golf links in your pyjamas. He grinned, pushing back the chair and getting to his feet. They heard him rumble up the stairs, and Francis saw the fear return to Grace's eyes as soon as he was gone. They were all putting on a face, weren't they? She wasn't alone in that. Frances finished her tea and replaced her cup carefully in the saucer as worry enveloped her again. Life will have to go on, won't it? For us all. The silence was broken only when Eddie trundled down the stairs and stuck his head around the door. He was wearing his smart trousers and shirt, his hair tidy, and he kissed his mother and looked around at them all puzzled. What have I done? Grace took his hand, rubbing at his arm. Nothing, my love. Off you go. He slipped out of the back door, calling, See you later, and they heard the clatter as he took hold of his bike, the rattle of the gate as he left. Frances glanced at the clock. 10 minutes to 9. Time was grinding away. She looked to Geraldine, then Grace. Grace knew the ways of the theatre. She clasped her hands in her lap, took a deep breath. Do you miss your dancing days, Grace? Grace sat back into her chair. Sometimes, but not often. What did you do? Geraldine was curious, and Frances relaxed a little. There hadn't been time for them all to chat easily because Geraldine worked long hours at the dock offices in Grimsby, and when she returned, the girls had already left for the theatre. I was a classical ballerina, she said with pride, and Davy was a renowned violinist. This was all before the Great War, of course. She paused, remembering. The life is different, the discipline different. More respectable, Jessie offered. Grace frowned, her dismay showing on her face. Not at all. I'm not saying that what you girls do is not respectable. But it isn't, Mum, Jessie countered. If Aunt Iris knew I wanted to dance with the corps de ballet, she'd have treated me differently. You can't say she wouldn't. Frances wondered how Grace would answer. Iris was a condescending snob. Frances had met her only briefly, but once was enough. Over the past few years, she had realised there were many people like Iris. The problem was you never knew who they were until it was too late. Grace was reluctant to answer. Possibly. Geraldine said, Well, you can't entirely blame your aunt. Variety is the child of the music hall, and so many of the big stars have succumbed to drink and depravity. It hasn't earned a reputation for loose morals for nothing. Frances was shocked. That's a tad unfair, Geraldine. There are plenty of people who behave like that. It's not linked only to the theatre, or movie stars for that matter. The older woman was picking at crumbs on the table and placing them on her plate with a sprinkle of her fingers. I agree. It's an observation, not an opinion. But it seems more prevalent. The excess, the drama, and young girls' heads are easily turned by the lure of the bright lights. Why, only last week there was the story of that young woman from Louth. Off she went to London in search of stardom and ended up dying from some botched... She broke off abruptly, then continued. Operation. Such a waste. But that could happen to anyone. Frances's voice was high and she could feel her neck and face reddening. She had dreams. Dreams that had led to disappointment as they had done for her. Jessie turned and looked at her, Grace too. Geraldine remained calm. We've all heard stories like this. Charming young men who only have one thing on their minds. I'm sure Grace will be worried about Jessie going to London on her own. Harry too. I won't end up like that, Jessie snapped, affronted. Harry's not like that. How it irritated. Harry wasn't like that, but Jessie had almost lost him, hadn't she? Flattered by the cocky comedian Billy Lane, who had been second top of the bill during the summer season. You have no idea how you'll end up, Frances said sharply. Look how easily you fell for Billy Lane's charms. I did no such thing. Jessie was horrified. Frances could have bitten off her tongue. Jessie hadn't deserved that. She wasn't that kind of girl, but then neither was she. People would make up their own minds about her, whether she liked it or not. I'm sorry, she said gently. I shouldn't have said that. I'm truly sorry. You did nothing to lead Billy on. Billy is one of life's chances. My point exactly, Geraldine said. Frances held her gaze, fighting to hide her disappointment. Geraldine wouldn't understand. Life was too black and white for some people. Grace reached across and pressed at Frances's arm. It's all right. We're all feeling jumpy today. She leaned back in her chair again. If Jessie decides to go to London, I'll be worried. Of course I will. I only hope she finds as good a friend as you when she does. Oh, the bitter irony. Frances couldn't reply. If they knew. She clutched the side of her chair. It was as if the whole world had tilted and she was sliding off the edge. Please forgive me, Jessie. Jessie shook her head, reaching out to take Frances's hand, offering a sympathetic smile. Nothing to forgive. Like Mum said, we're all feeling rotten. Frances forced herself to smile, pretending that it had all been forgotten, but her heart was heavy. She pushed back her chair and stood up, picking up her cigarettes and matches from the dresser. I'm going outside for a smoke. Leave the dishes. I'll come back in and clear up, then I'll give the kitchen a thorough clean. Good idea, Geraldine said, tapping the table with her palms. I was thinking these windows could do with a wash, although it will be difficult with the tape across them. I'll give you a hand. Jessie began stacking the plates. Grace got to her feet. I'll be at my sewing machine if anyone wants me. They were all trying to act as if her outburst had never happened, but it had. And it was awkward. Frances was glad to leave the room. By 11, Jessie and Frances had cleaned every nook and cranny in the kitchen and swept and dusted the sitting room. Tackling the task with more vigour than necessary had helped dilute her disappointment, if nothing else. But Geraldine's words dominated her thoughts. As the clock chimed the hour, Geraldine removed her apron and hung it on the hook by the pantry door. The girls downed tools, washed and dried their hands, and went into the back room, where sunlight streamed through the window, catching the dust motes as they swirled and settled. The pair of them sat down, and Frances was solemn as the two older women took their places at the table. The Prime Minister was due to speak at past. Geraldine reached out and turned the dial on the wireless. The small room became unbearably stuffy. Geraldine got up and pushed the sash as high as it would go. The breeze was slight, but welcome. The sun bright as it moved higher into the bluest of skies. Geraldine had picked up her book, but not turned a page. Grace had gone back into her room and returned with her embroidery, the light catching the steel of the needle as it moved in and out of the cloth. Frances looked at the clock, and, as the hands moved around to the quarter hour, the familiar voice of the BBC announcer broke the uneasy quiet. This is London. Geraldine marked her page, closed the book and placed it on the table. Grace lowered her sewing into her lap. When Neville Chamberlain spoke, he sounded the old man he was, tired and weary. She knew it was bad news. They all did. And when he said they were indeed at war, no one moved, no one spoke, but sat in the small silence as he continued to talk. War. It was war. Frances tried to concentrate, but her thoughts were starting to tumble in her head. Harry would have to fight. Would Eddie? She looked at Grace's face. It was rigid, as was Geraldine's. When I finish speaking, Chamberlain continued, certain detailed announcements will be made on behalf of the government. Give these your close attention. The silence as the speech ended was followed by the peal of bells. Small tears glistened on Grace's cheeks, and she reached in her sleeve for her handkerchief, rubbed briskly at her eyes and under her nose. How very silly of me. Jessie reached out, but Grace pulled herself upright. Don't fuss, Jessie. I'm perfectly all right. Frances admired her inner steel. Grace might be weakened by ill health, but she was a strong woman. Frances would be strong too. Geraldine stilled her with a finger to her lips as the BBC announcer spoke again. "This is London." Geraldine leaned closer to the wireless. "Closing of places of entertainment." The announcer's voice was crisp and without emotion. Frances gasped, her hand to her throat. She turned to Jessie, who was staring at the wireless. The announcer continued. "All cinemas, theatres and other places of entertainment are to be closed immediately until further notice." Jessie sprang to her feet, but Frances tugged at her arm and pulled her down again. "Shh," Geraldine hissed, but the words went over Frances's head and out through the window. What else was there to know? She had lost her job, Jessie too. But she couldn't leave Barkhouse Lane, not yet. Her happiness depended on it. Chapter 2. At the end of the government notices, there was another silence before they played the national anthem, and all four of them got to their feet. Geraldine appeared taller than she'd ever been, her shoulders back, her head erect. Jessie knew that she'd lost her brother and her fiancé in the Great War. Their pictures held pride of place in her room. So many women had been left to fend for themselves after the conflict, and now it would happen again. She said a silent prayer that Harry would be safe, for he would have to fight now, like so many others who had already answered the call. The thought made her shudder. Her mother was glassy-eyed, and to Jessie suddenly small and frail, and a shiver of fear shot through her. She was still recovering and not yet returned to her old self. Would this set her back again? And what of Eddie? Would she be left with photographs, like Geraldine? When the anthem ended, they sat back down, somewhat revived because of the music, the call for king and country, but the shock was visible on everyone's face. Grace closed her eyes, turning her wedding ring on her finger, and Geraldine reached across and lowered the volume on the wireless. Jessie sighed heavily and turned to Frances. "What are we going to do now? That's both of us out of work." She put her elbows on the table and rested her chin in her hands. "There's no chance of me going to London now." Geraldine sighed. "There will be worse things to worry about, young Jessie." Jessie was close to tears. "I know that," she said quietly. "I wasn't being starry-eyed. I was thinking of our immediate problem, and that's paying the rent." She turned again to Frances, who had remained motionless throughout the broadcast. Her face was pale. It made her dark eyes darker still. "We ought to go to the theatre, don't you think? Find out what's going to happen?" They couldn't just sit here. She had to do something to distract herself from the fear that had settled in the pit of her stomach. For Harry, for them all. She was responsible for her mother now. It would be a while before Grace returned to full strength, and although Eddie was working, he was only an apprentice. It would be years before he got a full wage, and the money Uncle Norman had given to them when they left Norfolk wouldn't last forever. She got up and pushed her chair under the table. "Nothing will happen." Frances stared at the wireless. "The theatres are closed." "Until further notice," Geraldine interrupted. "Take heart, girls. The announcer also said that they would open again in some areas. Possible and probable, wouldn't you say, Grace?" Grace gave her daughter an encouraging smile. "Without a doubt." So there was already hope then. Remember what your father used to say? Music gives people comfort. They won't be closed for long. Geraldine pressed her hands on the table in front of her. "It's important not to panic. We will deal with whatever comes our way, just as we did the last time. Eh, Grace?" Grace seemed to gain strength from Geraldine's words, and Jessie was so grateful to her, so glad to be here and not with Aunt Iris. "Whatever happens, we're all going to help each other through it. Don't forget that." Jessie felt her shoulders soften. Geraldine was right. She held on to the back of the chair. "I'm going to the Empire," she said to Frances. "Coming?" Frances shook herself a little and got to her feet. "Yes, we need to find out what's going on." Her voice was weak and she seemed dazed. "Are you all right, Frances?" Grace was concerned. "Yes, I'm fine." She pushed back her chair, smiled at them all, reached out and touched Jessie's arm. "Let me do my hair and get some lipstick on first. Can't go out without my best face on, can I now?" "That's the spirit," Geraldine urged. "Business as usual." Jessie felt cheered. She mustn't lose sight of her goals. Not for war, not for anything. She had to take care of her mum and Eddie. One day she would buy her mum the house Dad had always promised her. It just might take a little longer than she'd anticipated. Geraldine smiled. "The show must go on, must it not?" "Absolutely," Jessie said, her spirits already revived. When they were ready, they picked up their cardigans and bags, and Frances hung back while Jessie kissed her mother goodbye. "We won't be long, Mum. I'm sure the owner, Jack Holland, will be at the theatre and we can find out where we stand." "And say goodbye," Frances added. "A lot of the cast will head for home. There was only 3 weeks left of the show." She walked over to the door. "It might take a lot longer than that for the theatres to reopen, and we might not be in the right area when they do." Jessie felt a flutter of panic. She'd have to find other work here to keep them all afloat, but if Frances left, it wouldn't be the same. She pushed her lip forward, and Frances grinned. "Well, I'm not going anywhere, Jessie, but the others might." That was what she'd wanted to hear from her friend. Jessie went to stand beside her, linked her arm through hers. "That's the best news I've heard all day." Geraldine came through from the kitchen. "I'll delay dinner as long as I can. Otherwise, I'll put yours on a low heat in the oven." She paused. "And girls," Jessie tilted her head to one side, "gas masks." Jessie felt a chill ripple down her spine. They had all seen the notices urging them to carry their gas masks at all times, the government fearing aerial attack. The black rubber monstrosities in their cardboard boxes had been pushed under their beds and forgotten about. "I'll get yours." Frances dashed upstairs and quickly returned, handing Jessie the small brown box and putting her own over her shoulder. They would have to remember to take them with them from now on. They stepped out into the street and walked up the small incline to the top of Barkhouse Lane, then rounded the corner onto Humber Street, which opened out, giving them a glimpse of the sea. The sun glistened on the water, and boats moved along the horizon just as they always did. The sky was blue, the sun warm, and it was hard to believe that it wasn't like every other Sunday. Seagulls screamed overhead, swooping, diving, and Frances wanted to scream too as panic took hold. She lifted her head. She mustn't weaken. She had to be strong. She led the way across the road so that they could look down onto the promenade where life continued as normal, because, despite the news, people were out enjoying themselves. Cars trundled past as they headed down the hill towards the Empire. Already shopkeepers were putting boards over their windows, paper signs declaring it would be business as usual fixed on the wooden planks. Their doors remained open, and people drifted in and out as they walked along. She needed to get another job as soon as she could, but so many others would be out looking for work. There would be no more holidays, no more summer seasons by the seaside, and her savings were not what she had hoped. She inhaled the sea air. "Lord, let Grace be right. Let the theatres reopen soon." Paper strips had been pasted on the glass doors of the Empire, declaring they were closed until further notice. Bad news had not come unexpected. She pulled on the brass handle, waiting for Jessie to go first, then followed. The door to the box office opened, and their friend Dolly, an usherette, came dashing out to greet them, her blonde hair a halo. "Isn't it just the worst news? I thought them in London with all their big brains would sort it out, didn't you?" Jessie agreed. "I've had my head in the clouds this last week. I didn't notice how close we were to war. But to close the theatres?" Frances briefly closed her eyes, wanting to shut out the words, as the girls prattled on about things they couldn't control. Empty words, She was sick of them. What did it matter what we thought? Frances snapped. It wouldn't have changed anything. The two girls stared at her. She was only 5 years older than them, but 23 felt a lifetime away from 18. She tried to remember what it had been like to be so unaware of the harsh realities of life, but she couldn't. "I'm sorry, girls," she apologised. "I don't know what's the matter with me." "It's all right," Dolly said kindly. "It's such a blow, isn't it? Mum was crying when the news came. Dad's lost his job, so have I. It's all such a worry." Frances felt for them. Dolly's dad, George, was the stage doorman, and his lovely wife, Olive, was always sending him to work with little treats for the girls. "How long have you been here?" she asked, trying to smooth things over. "Since 10. Mr. Holland asked Dad to open up and bring the wireless down from his office and put it in the bar in case anyone came. A lot of the acts have already come and gone." The doors to the stalls had been weighted open, and voices drifted into the cool of the foyer. "I'm manning the box office in case people want their money back. Such a shame when it was all going so well." There was a clatter of metal from inside the auditorium. "We need to find out what's going on in there." Frances tipped her head towards the inner doors. "Catch up with you later, Dolly." "You're not leaving, then?" The girl's face brightened. "Not for the time being," Frances said, for where would she go? It had meant the world to her to be able to stay in Cleethorpes for so long, instead of touring from town to town, a different theatre each week on the variety circuit. A long run meant stability, a chance to save. "Me too," Jessie smiled. "Cleethorpes is home to us all now." The house lights were on in the auditorium, and members of the cast and staff were trudging up and down the stairs at the front of the stage with boxes and bags, packing away props and instruments. Mary, the wardrobe mistress, small and round with tight grey curls, was standing beside two sturdy metal clothes rails. Sally, Kay and Rita, three of the dancers who comprised half of the variety girls, were handing over their costumes, and Mary was checking them off her list. Ginny, the other member of their troupe, was nowhere to be seen. "Hello, ducks. When you've a minute, can you bring me your bits up?" Mary sighed. "Who'd have thought it, eh? I prayed me ruddy socks off I did. But there you go. At least we know what's what, don't we? Instead of all this buggering around." Mary tried to sound cheerful, but her voice was edged with sadness, and Frances clasped her shoulder, gave it a gentle squeeze. She'd thought the same herself. There was strength in knowing where you stood, even if it was alone. "Yes, all this buggering around has done for us all," Frances agreed. "But they've picked on the wrong ones this time, eh?" The woman laughed. "Too right, lovey." Jessie had gone on ahead, and Frances watched her disappear into the wings as Mary continued with her inventory. The ending of a good run was always tinged with sadness, but she'd never felt as she did today. She hurried down the stairs, eager to help Mary finish her task, and found Jessie and Ginny in the dressing room, whispering, their heads close. They stopped when Frances came in and looked awkward. "Hiya, Frances." Ginny was subdued. She adjusted the costumes that were draped over her arm. Her glorious red hair was pulled back into a bun at the back of her head, and it made her look harsher than usual. The bulbs around the mirror were lit, but the many photos, greeting cards and notes had been taken down. Only Frances's mirror remained decorated with words from well-wishers. Jessie stepped back to let Ginny escape, and they heard her tread heavily on the stairs. Frances put her bag down on the dressing table, removed her cardigan, and laid it over the back of her chair. "What's the matter with Ginny?" Jessie shrugged. "Upset. We all are." She quickly turned her back and hurried out of the room. Frances began to peel away her cards from the mirror. Cards from her brothers, the words sparse. Others from her two sisters, full of news and love. Love. She chewed at her lip. How she missed them. She held the one from her parents, read her mother's words, her precise hand so familiar. dear Mammy and Daddy. She'd been 15 when they'd waved her off at Kildare Station, the day as clear to her as if it had happened yesterday. Her mother's tears, her father's fears for her, their pride. She wanted to weep for the girl she once was. Jessie returned with her vanity case in one hand, clutching her own treasured photographs and cards to her chest with the other. Last night she'd had a dressing room of her own to celebrate the fact that she had her own solo spot in front of Vernon Leroy. The girls had tried to make the moment special for her, but the celebrations had been brief, as was their happiness. Frances took down the photo of Imogen with a heaviness in her heart. Jessie put her own cards down on the dressing table. Pretty girl, your niece, Imogen, isn't it? Imogen, yes, it is, Frances said, her voice softening. The weight of her lies was unbearable. Jessie trusted her, looked up to her. She caught the girl's reflection in the mirror. Would she understand? Jessie leaned over her shoulder. Gosh, doesn't she look like you? Is she your sister's child or one of your brothers? Frances swallowed. Jessie, She stopped as the rest of the girls trudged into the room. Jack's going to be ages, apparently, Rita said, settling herself in the battered armchair. We might as well wait in here. Kay and Sally rummaged around the room, picking up the last remaining hair grips and rubber bands, putting them all in a pile on the dressing table. Ginny came back and sat on the chair that she'd had all summer. Sorry, Frances, what were you saying? Jessie asked as the girls chatted amongst themselves. Frances shrugged. The interruption had unsettled her. I can't remember. Rita took out her cigarettes. I'm gasping for a fag. She held out the packet of Woodbines. Want one? Frances declined, and Rita adjusted herself in the chair, crossing her long legs. Are you going to hang around? Frances asked, as Rita fumbled for her matches. She'd been a good head girl, and Frances would probably bump into her again, sooner or later. Rita shook her head, and her blonde ponytail swung from side to side. Nope, already packed most of the stuff at the flat. Going to get the first train back to Manchester. Pointless hanging about here. She put her cigarette to her lips, lit up, tossed the spent match into a tin ashtray. What about you? Frances leaned against the dressing table. Not sure. Find work. Any work will do for the time being. Rita nodded. We can't sit about waiting. We've got to get out there first, before anyone else. You know what it's like. She puffed out a long plume of smoke. Frances watched it drift upwards. I'm not going to be back of the queue. Are you? Not if I can help it. Frances couldn't afford to dither about. The rest of the girls were young. They would perhaps go home until things changed, but she didn't have that luxury. Kay picked up an old copy of the Stage newspaper and was about to drop it into the wastebasket. Frances stopped her. Mind if I have a look? There's nothing in it, Kay said, handing it over. Nothing that matters now, anyway. It'll all be cancelled. Frances wasn't bothered. There would be news of where other friends had been working, what theatres were still doing variety and hadn't been converted to cinemas. She had to trust that the theatres would open again, and, like Rita, she needed to be ready for when they did. She turned the pages, not really taking anything in, until she read a short paragraph in the variety gossip column. Oh, she gasped, putting her hand to her mouth. The girls stopped what they were doing, and when she looked up, they were staring at her. She flushed, embarrassed, but her heart was thumping wildly as she tried to compose herself. The Randolphs are back in London. They've got a show. She corrected herself. They were going to star in a new production at the Coliseum. Johnny and Ruby? Rita asked. I saw that. Kay twisted towards Rita. Do you know them? Rita shook her head. I thought they were making it big in the States. Wonder what they've come back for. Surely not because of the war. She drew on her cigarette. They must have been over there, what? 3, 4 years? More? 4 years, Frances said. It's 4. 4 years this month, the 15th. she'd never forget. I'm sure it's longer than that. Rita was staring at her and she felt pressured to say more. I was on the same bill, in the chorus. Frances turned away from them, talked to them through the mirror. It felt easier not looking at them directly. It previewed in Manchester, then went to London. They took her to America. And you didn't go with it? Jessie frowned at her, and Frances felt her neck redden with heat. I was supposed to. She hesitated, not wanting to say too much. It didn't work out. Lucky blighters, Rita said. I'd love to go to America. Not much chance of that now. She stubbed out her cigarette and got to her feet, sweeping her hands over her skirt to smooth the creases, picked up her bag and slipped it over her arm. I'm off back to the digs. Aren't you going to stop and find out what Jack has to say? Frances asked, relieved that the conversation had been brought to an end. She put the paper to one side. It was bad enough that war had been declared, but to know that Johnny was back? She needed to focus on something else, something other than him. Write it down on the back of a fag packet and tell me later, Rita threw over her shoulder. You can't do anything, and I'm not hanging around on a promise. Not my style. Jessie dipped her head, biting her lip, and Frances had to look away in case the pair of them laughed. Rita had been through the band like a dose of salts. Kay and Sally decided to leave with Rita. Hardly surprising, since they had followed her about all summer like ducklings. The remaining 3 girls finished clearing the dressing room, and when they were done, took their bags upstairs, leaving them in the small office at the stage door. George was taking down the notices from the felt board outside in the corridor, and his face lit up when he saw the girls. Hey, you lasses are a sight for sore eyes. He pushed his glasses to the top of his head. Such a shame it had to end like this. Jessie put her arm about him and gave him a squeeze. It is, George, but we're still going to be here, me and Frances. And me, Ginny added. He smiled, his old grey eyes crinkling. Well, just remember, you can pop over the road any time and see me and the missus. You're always welcome. Back in the auditorium, they found the owner and manager, Jack Holland, on stage. He'd been a familiar sight throughout the production, totally hands-on and well-liked by his staff on both sides of the curtain. What remained of the cast and crew was scattered about the stalls, waiting for him to speak, and the girls skipped down the steps at the prompt side of the stage to join them. He'd removed his jacket and stood in his shirt sleeves. Even from a distance they could see how tired he was. He must be devastated, Jessie said, pushing down her seat next to Frances. I know it's difficult for all of us, but he's put all his money into this place. Frances wriggled, making herself comfortable. I suppose he'll lose his shirt if the theatres don't reopen sharpish. It was a sobering thought, but one that many theatre owners would be facing. The Empire had been closed for months, the previous owners running out of money. The same had been happening elsewhere, and many of the grand old theatres had been given over to cinemas. Jack hadn't settled for the easy, or, it had to be said, more profitable option, but had risked his arm on a variety show. Jack cleared his throat, and the conversation stilled as he began to speak. I've already said goodbye to a few of the cast and crew. He paused, and Frances looked about the rows to see who had stayed. Not many. Mike, the stage manager, was sitting on a wicker hamper at the side of the stage, his arms folded across his wide chest. A couple of the cleaners had seated themselves in the back row, along with Dolly and her dad, George. The door at the back of the auditorium opened, and Madeline Moore, the top of the bill, slid discreetly onto the end of the row. It would have been easy for her to wait for news to be brought to her door, but that wasn't her style. Frances turned back to hear what Jack had to say. Thank you to those who have remained. He was sombre as he looked out into the auditorium, the flat of his hand above his eyes. He brought it down again, slid it into his trouser pocket, stared down at the stage thoughtfully, then up again. Many of you will be eager to get home, back to your families, so I'll keep it brief." He paused again. "War has brought our happy show to a rather abrupt end, but it was good while it lasted, wasn't it? You did me and this town proud." People shuffled in their seats, lifting themselves a little higher. It was bittersweet to leave in the middle of success, but what was the end of a show compared to what everyone faced once they walked out of the theatre? Frances closed her eyes, trying to concentrate on what he said, her thoughts in turmoil. "I can't ask you all to wait and see what happens because I can't afford to pay you a retainer." Frances opened her eyes. It was hardly Jack's fault. It was no one's fault, was it? People had done what they could, but a line had to be drawn and they had to make the best of it. "I will, however, pay the wages you were due this week. I feel it's the very least I can do." "That's kind of him," Jessie said. "He didn't have to do anything. He's probably worse off than any of us." Frances shushed her, directing Jessie's attention back to the stage. "The theatres will open again, I have no doubt of that," he continued, "and we need to pull together if we're to get through." He took a deep breath. "And win this ruddy war." He was quiet for a time and people became uneasy. He looked up again, smiling. "What I want to say is, keep steadfast." He clasped his hands together and shook them fiercely. "This world will be a sadder place without song and dance and laughter." His voice wavered and he paused, composed himself before he spoke again. When he did, his voice was strong. "When the theatres open, we'll be leading the charge, my friends, because I'm going to make sure that the Empire is entertaining the crowds again, twice nightly." There was a ripple of applause from around the theatre, and Frances joined in. His words had given them hope, and, things being as they were, hope was needed as never before. Chapter 3. The following day, Frances left the house early and caught the bus for the hour-long journey to Waltham, a village less than 5 miles inland. Monday was wash day in the Dawkins household, and she knew Patsy would appreciate the help. Finding work was a priority, but she told herself that one day wouldn't make much difference if it meant she could be with Imogen. The kids were not back at school after summer term, and Frances watched the children through the kitchen window. Imogen's skipping rope was around 5-year-old Collie's waist, and he was holding onto it, pretending to be a horse, galloping around the lawn, 3-year-old Imogen jiggling the reins. The pair of them were racing around in the dappled sunlight that filtered through the fruit trees towards the bottom of the garden. The neat white cottage in Waltham was heaven. Patsy and Colin Dawkins her angels. Patsy came and stood beside her. "And the world keeps turning." She put her hand to Frances's shoulder. "What they don't know can't hurt them, thank the Lord." It didn't comfort her. If only that were true. Patsy ran the tap and washed her hands, flicking off the excess water before drying them on the towel that hung over the range. "Don't worry yourself needlessly, Franny. I know they'll use the airfield, but I reckon we'll be safe enough out here." "I wasn't thinking of the war, Patsy. I was thinking of the future, Imogen's future." Frances turned away from the window and leaned with her back against the sink so that she could see her friend's face and gauge her reaction. "Johnny's in England. It was in the stage. The pair of them are back." Patsy hung the towel over the rail, her back to Frances. "Ah, so that's why you came in looking like you were ready to take on Hitler single-handed." Frances folded her arms. "Was it that obvious?" "Well, they were bound to come home eventually." Patsy turned. "So, what are you going to do?" Frances shrugged. "I have no idea. I didn't sleep a wink last night, going over and over it all in my head." She gave her a wry smile. "It caught me off guard." It had reignited the anger, a strong flame which she had previously let die, not giving it air so that it had almost been extinguished. Angry with him, at herself. Had she really been so stupid? But after the anger had come curiosity. Had their love been a lie? You must want to do something, Patsy said, choosing her words carefully, or you wouldn't have said anything. I need to talk about it, and I can't talk about it with anyone but you. For that, she had no one else to blame. If only she'd spoken to Geraldine when she first moved in, it could all have been so different. I was so ruddy angry. She shook her head. How could he turn his back on me, on us? Patsy came and stood beside her. I don't know, my love. She leaned across the windowsill and pulled the dead leaves from the begonia that was doing its best to keep blooming. She tossed the dry leaves into the bin, brushed her hands together, pressed Francis's arm, held her gaze. You have to write to him. Francis looked down at her feet. The toes of her shoes were almost worn through. They wouldn't last much longer. Why? She asked, looking back up at her friend. What makes you think he'd reply this time? She had sent letter after letter to America. She'd waited for the promised ticket that never came. Even when she told him she was pregnant, how frightened she was, there was no response. I don't, but you have to try, Patsy urged. Imogen is his child. He should support you, both of you. I'm not going to use Imogen like that, never. She was surprised by the venom in her voice, and she stopped, not wanting the poison inside her to take hold again. I'm sorry, Patsy. I don't want to argue with you, but I'm so damn tired, and it's brought everything to the surface again. All of it, good and bad. It's bound to. Patsy picked up her wicker washing basket and settled it on her hip. Anyway, he should be made to pay something. Francis stood away from the sink and walked towards Patsy. It's only ever the women who pay. Imogen will be paying the price for the rest of her life. Imogen didn't deserve the shame that would follow her around. It was her mother's mistake, but she would be the one who suffered most. Francis followed Patsy outside into the garden. The sun was high, the breeze warm, and the washing they'd done earlier had dried in no time at all. Patsy removed the prop so that the line was easier to reach, and the pair of them started pulling at the pegs, folding the clothes and dropping them into the basket at their feet. Patsy had been her rock. Her generosity and Colin's had allowed Francis to keep her child, and she would never be able to repay their kindness. She looked away, blinking back tears. Over by the vegetable patch, 6-year-old Bobby was on his knees, lifting leaves, searching for caterpillars and grubs. He called out, and the skipping rope was abandoned as Imogen and Collie ran over to help. Any onlooker would think they were brothers and sister. Why didn't you say something sooner? Patsy asked. Francis tipped her head back. I don't know. If it wasn't for Imogen, I could forget about him. Ha! Patsy raised her eyebrows. Could you? Really? She rested her hands on the line and looked at Francis, who was facing her, the pair of them moving along seamlessly as they had done on stage so many years ago. Patsy had been the head dancer, keeping a chorus of 12 girls in line, a big sister, a teacher, but most of all a friend. Francis had been fresh off the boat from Ireland and had arrived in Blackpool with her head full of dreams, wanting to make her mammy and daddy proud, their sacrifices worthwhile. The two of them had stayed in touch after the summer ended, long before Patsy had said goodbye to her dance.